The wind off the Yellowstone River cut sideways through downtown Billings, rattling the plastic sheeting Grady Holt had wrapped around his shoulders like a coat that had given up trying to be a coat. He knelt against the brick wall of a shuttered feed store, palms cracked from cold, watching his own breath rise and disappear against a gray Montana sky. 3 days into the disguise, and already his body had forgotten what warmth felt like, or perhaps some quiet part of him thought. It had simply remembered. A silver SUV slowed at the curb. The window came down. "Oh my God. Oh my God, Brittany, look at this." Brittany Cole leaned across the passenger seat, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, phone already raised and recording. "No way. No way. Is that? That's him. That's Grady Holt." The driver, Tyler Marsh, laughed, the kind of laugh that had no joy in it, only appetite. The Grady Holt, Billings' own golden boy, ranked on some magazine list 2 years running, sitting in the gutter like a stray dog. Grady did not move. He had trained himself in 3 days not to move. "Say something for the camera," Brittany said, delighted. "Come on. Tell everyone how the great cattle king ended up smelling like a dumpster." A small crowd was gathering now, the way crowds always gathered around something that promised humiliation for free. A man in a Carhartt jacket chuckled. A teenage boy filmed on his own phone, angling for a better shot. Grady kept his eyes on the pavement, on a crack running through the concrete like a vein, and let the words land on him the way hail lands on a tin roof, loud, relentless, but not, he told himself, capable of getting inside. "You know what's funny," Tyler said, louder now, playing to the crowd. "My dad used to work security at Holt Cattle," said the old man. Grady's father used to talk about him like he was a prize calf he'd rescued off the highway. Fed him, dressed him up, paraded him around at every fundraiser till the cameras stopped caring. He shook his head, grinning. Guess the prize calf finally remembered where he came from. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now, and which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. Something in Grady's chest folded inward quietly like paper. He had not expected that particular truth to be spoken aloud in public by a stranger who meant it only as a joke. He had spent 11 years building glass towers and beef contracts, and a name that appeared in ledgers across 4 states, and none of it had ever managed to erase the sentence Tyler Marsh had just thrown out the window of an SUV like a piece of trash. A prize calf he'd rescued off the highway. "Leave him alone," said an older woman passing with a grocery bag, not unkindly, more from a desire not to be near the scene than any real defense of the man on the ground. "We're not doing anything," Brittany said, sweetly, camera still rolling. "We're just saying hi to an old friend." "Right, Grady, we went to Billings West together. Homecoming king senior year. Look at him now." Tyler leaned further out the window. "Hey, you need money for a shelter bed, buddy? I got a 5 in the cup holder. You can have it. On one condition." He grinned at Brittany. "Say thank you, Mr. Holt." The crowd laughed. Someone whistled. Grady lifted his eyes then just once, and looked directly into Tyler's face. He did not speak. He had learned over the last 3 days that silence was the only armor he had left, the only thing that could not be photographed and turned into 40 seconds of entertainment for people who had never once wondered what he ate for breakfast or whether he had eaten at all. The SUV pulled away a moment later, laughter trailing out the window, already forgetting him, already scrolling toward the next thing. The crowd dispersed, slowly disappointed there had been no better show. Grady sat alone against the brick wall for a long time after that, long enough for the gray afternoon to slide into a grayer evening, long enough for the ache in his ribs. 3 nights of concrete do that to a body no longer used to it, become simply a fact of his existence, rather than something worth noticing. He thought unwillingly of another cold. A colder one. A blizzard. 15 years gone. A boy of 16 with frostbitten fingers curled into fists inside sleeves too thin for a Montana January, walking a county road with no destination because any destination he could name belonged to a man he was terrified of. He remembered the particular kind of hunger that stops being hunger and becomes something closer to silence, a hollowing out that made the whole world go quiet and slow, the way it was going quiet and slow now. He had promised himself back then, curled in a stranger's barn with hay for a blanket, that if he ever had money he would never again know what it felt like to not know where he would sleep. He had broken that promise on purpose 3 days ago, and he was only now beginning to understand the cost of it. "Why are you doing this to yourself?" Dutch Ryan had asked him the week before, standing in the glass-walled office on the top floor of the Holt Cattle Building. Arms crossed, jaw tight, with the particular worry of a man who had known Grady since they were both 9 years old, stealing peaches off the Hendricks orchard fence. "You built all this so you'd never have to go back. And now you want to walk right back into it, willingly." Grady had not had a good answer then. He was not sure he had one now, sitting against a wall with strangers' laughter still ringing faintly in his ears. Only a feeling low and persistent that had been growing in him since his father's funeral 6 months earlier. The funeral where 400 people had shaken his hand and called him a credit to the community, and not one of them, not a single one, had asked him how he was doing, because it had not occurred to any of them that a man with that much money could be anything other than fine. He had stood at the graveside in a black suit that cost more than most people's trucks, surrounded by people who loved what he represented, and understood with a clarity that frightened him that he did not know a single person who loved him for nothing at all. Not for his name, not for his company, not for the ranches or the cattle contracts or the foundation with his father's name carved into its marble lobby, just for the fact of him standing there breathing. He wanted more than he had wanted anything in a long time to find out if such a person existed in the world, or if kindness like that had died out along with the boy who used to sleep in strangers' barns, replaced entirely by people counting what a smile might be worth to them. Night came down over Billings in earnest, now the streetlights flickering on one by one along the avenue, throwing long orange stripes across the pavement. Somewhere down the block, a diner sign buzzed pink against the dark Home Plate Cafe. Half its letters dimmed with age, and the smell of coffee and frying onions drifted out each time the door swung open, warm air escaping into the cold like something being wasted. Grady watched that door for a long moment, hunger gnawing, quiet and steady beneath his ribs, humiliation still sitting hot in his chest from the afternoon, and made no move toward it. He had learned enough in 3 days to know that most doors did not open for men who looked like him, that most people crossed the street rather than meet his eyes, that kindness, real kindness, asking nothing back, was rarer than he had let himself remember. He pulled the plastic sheeting tighter around his shoulders, tucked his frozen hands beneath his arms, and settled deeper into the shadow of the wall to wait out the night, not yet knowing that the door glowing pink at the end of the block was about to change the rest of his life. The offices of Holt Cattle Co. occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower on Montana Avenue, the kind of building that looked out of place next to the century-old brick storefronts of downtown Billings, as though someone had dropped a piece of Denver into the middle of cattle country and let it stay. From the corner office on the 17th floor, Dutch Ryan could see the whole valley, the rim rocks cutting a pale scar along the horizon, the river winding silver gray through the flats, and somewhere out there, invisible from this height, the man he had grown up with, sleeping God knew where, wrapped in God knew what. He had not slept well in 3 nights. "You look terrible," Grady said, stepping through the door the following evening, showered now, changed into jeans and a plain flannel shirt, but still carrying something hollow behind his eyes that Dutch did not like. "I look terrible because my best friend has been living outside for the better part of a week," Dutch said, not turning from the window. "You want to explain that to me again, slower this time, because it didn't make any more sense the second time I thought about it than it did the first." Grady sat down heavily in the chair across from the desk, his own desk, technically, though he had not touched the papers on it in days, and rubbed a hand over his jaw. There was a bruise of exhaustion under each eye, the particular gray pallor of a man who has not eaten enough, or slept enough, or been warm enough in longer than his body knows how to forgive. "I saw Tyler Marsh yesterday," Grady said quietly. "Filmed me. Him and some girl from Billings West. Called me a prize calf my father rescued off the highway." Dutch turned, then jaw tight. "I'll have somebody talk to him." "No." Grady's voice was flat, final. "That's not the point, Dutch. The point is he wasn't wrong." The silence that followed had weight to it. Dutch crossed the room slowly and sat on the edge of the desk, close enough that Grady could see the worry etched plain across a face he'd known since they were 9 years old, barefoot in July, stealing peaches off a fence that didn't belong to either one of them. "Talk to me," Dutch said. "Not the CEO talk, not the boardroom talk. Talk to me like it's still 1990-something and we're sitting on the tailgate of my dad's truck." Grady was quiet for a long moment, staring at his own hands. Hands that had once been raw and split from cold, now soft again, the calluses long since faded beneath years of signing contracts instead of stacking hay bales. He thought of his father's funeral. He thought of the marble lobby with the family name carved 8 inches high above the door, and the 400 people who had shaken his hand and told him what a credit he was to the community. and how not one of them had asked whether he was eating, whether he was sleeping, whether the man standing in that expensive suit was breaking apart quietly behind a face trained since childhood not to show it. When Harold took me in, Grady said, finally using his adoptive father's first name the way he only did when the pain was close to the surface, I used to think it was because he saw something in me. Some kid he could save. It took me until I was maybe 25 to understand he saw a photograph. A good one. Orphan boy, hard upbringing, rescued by a self-made man. That story ran in 4 newspapers before I turned 18 Dutch. 4. Every fundraiser, every campaign stop. There I was, standing next to him in a jacket that fit too well, smiling because I'd been told to smile. He shook his head slowly. He never hit me. Never raised his voice. He just never once looked at me like I was a person instead of a very good decision he'd made. Dutch said nothing. He had known some of this, the outline of it, the way you know the shape of a house from the street without ever having been inside, but never the whole of it laid bare like this. Never spoken aloud in a voice that still, after everything, went a little unsteady around the edges. And now he's gone. Grady went on, and I stood at that grave, and 400 people called me a credit to the community, and I realized I don't know. One person, not one Dutch, not you excluded, no offense, who has ever loved me for absolutely nothing. Not the company, not the name, not what I could do for them. Just me standing there being a person who needs somebody to care whether he's cold. I care whether you're cold, Dutch said quietly. I've cared about that since we were 9. I know. Grady's voice cracked just slightly, just enough. I know you do. But you knew me before any of this. Everybody I meet now already knows what I'm worth before they know my middle name. He looked up, and there was something raw and young in his face. Something that did not belong to a man who ran a 9-figure company. Something that belonged instead to a 16-year-old walking a county road in a blizzard, with nowhere to go. I need to know if it still exists, Dutch. Kindness that isn't looking for anything. I need to know before I spend the rest of my life, assuming it doesn't. Dutch exhaled slowly, some of the anger going out of him replaced by something heavier and sadder. He had watched Grady build an empire out of sheer stubbornness, and early mornings had watched him give scholarships to ranch kids nobody else would look twice at, had watched him quietly pay off a widow's mortgage 2 winters back, swear the bank to secrecy about where the money came from. He knew better than anyone alive that there was real goodness in the man sitting across from him. He also knew that goodness and self-destruction sometimes wore the same coat. You could get hurt out there, Dutch said. Really hurt. Not embarrassed on camera hurt. Frostbite hurt. Somebody doesn't realize who you are and things go wrong hurt. I know. You could get robbed. Assaulted. You could get sick, and nobody would know to call an ambulance for the actual Grady Holt instead of some John Doe. I know that too. Dutch studied him a long moment, the stubborn set of his jaw, the tired, searching look that had not left his eyes since the funeral. He thought about arguing further. He thought about calling it foolishness, calling it a crisis dressed up as a social experiment, calling it more honestly grief that hadn't found anywhere else to go. But he had also learned over 30 years of friendship when Grady Holt had made up his mind about something that mattered to him at the marrow, and arguing at that point only wasted breath that could be spent, instead making sure he came back in one piece. 1 month, Dutch said finally. That's it. 1 month, and if you haven't found whatever it is you're looking for, you come back inside, you let a doctor look at you, and you never do this again. And you carry the phone I gave you even if you don't use it for anything else. If something happens, I need a way to find you. Grady managed the first real smile Dutch had seen on him in days. Small, tired, but real. Deal. And Grady Dutch's voice caught him at the door. For what it's worth. I've known you since we were 9 years old, stealing peaches off a fence we had no business touching. I loved you before you had $1 to your name, and I'll love you after whatever happens out there. You already have one person who isn't looking for anything. He paused. I just understand why one isn't enough. Grady nodded, throat tight, and did not trust himself to answer with words. He pulled the door shut behind him, stepped back out into the Montana night, the cold already waiting for him on the sidewalk like something patient, and began walking back toward the part of the city where nobody knew his name, back toward the pink glow of a diner sign he had watched from a distance the night before, and the door he had not yet found the courage to open. Somewhere behind that door, though, he could not have known it yet. A young woman named Rosalind Hutchins was closing out the dinner shift, wiping down a counter and thinking, as she often did on slow winter nights, about the kind of man her father always said the world didn't make enough of anymore. The bell above the door of the Home Plate Cafe gave a thin, tired jingle as Grady Holt stepped inside, and for a moment he simply stood on the mat, blinking against the sudden warmth, feeling it hit his frozen face like something almost physically painful. The diner smelled of coffee gone slightly bitter on the burner of onions caramelizing somewhere behind a swinging kitchen door of maple syrup and old vinyl booths, and 40 years of Montana winters being kept, however, briefly outside. It was nearly closing. Only one booth was occupied, an old man in a canvas coat nursing a cup of decaf watching a muted television bolted high in the corner, and behind the counter, a young woman was wiping down the laminate with slow, unhurried strokes, her dark, blonde hair pulled back in a knot that had mostly come loose. Over the course of a long shift, she looked up when the bell rang, and Grady watched her take him in the way people so rarely took him in anymore, not as a name, not as a headline, not as a net worth attached to a face, just as a man. A very cold, very tired man standing just inside the door like he wasn't sure he was allowed to be there. "We're closing in 20 minutes, she said. "Not unkindly, but the coffee's still hot if you want to sit a minute and warm up." Grady hesitated. He had $11 folded into the pocket of his jeans. Money he'd set for himself as the limit for the month, no more. No access to anything beyond what a man with nothing might reasonably carry. And $11 felt suddenly like both too much and not nearly enough. "I don't have much," he said, and the sentence came out rougher than he meant it to, scraped by 3 days of silence. "I can pay for coffee. That's about it." Something crossed her face, then not pity exactly which he had learned in 3 days to dread the particular curdled sweetness of people who wanted credit for noticing you existed. This was something plainer, something that looked almost like recognition though they had never met. "Sit wherever you want," she said. "I'll bring you something." He chose the booth farthest from the window out of some old habit of not wanting to be seen, and lowered himself onto the cracked red vinyl with the particular care of a body that has spent 3 nights on concrete and has started quietly to protest. Across the room, the old man in the canvas coat glanced over once, assessed him with the mild, unbothered curiosity of someone who has seen every kind of stranger pass through a small-town diner, and went back to his television. The young woman came back a few minutes later, not with coffee alone, but with a bowl of soup steam rising off it in a thin, curling ribbon, and a plate with 2 thick slices of buttered toast beside it. "I didn't order this," Grady said, staring at it. "I know." She set it down in front of him anyway, along with a mug of coffee, and did not linger. Did not make a show of her own generosity, simply moved to refill the old man's decaf, as though she had done nothing at all worth remarking on. Grady sat very still for a long moment, looking down at the bowl. The steam curled up past his face, and beneath it, faint and unbearable, was the smell of something his memory recognized before his mind could place it. Beef and barley black pepper, a particular sharpness of onion cooked down slow. It was, he realized with a jolt, that went through his chest like cold water. Almost exactly the smell of a soup he had eaten only once before in his life, 15 years ago, in the kitchen of a man he had never been able to properly thank. He picked up the spoon. His hand, he noticed distantly, was shaking. "You don't have to eat it fast," the young woman said, coming back to refill his coffee, though he'd barely touched it. "Nobody's chasing you out of here." "Why are you doing this?" Grady asked. The question came out smaller than he intended, almost boyish, stripped of every defense. 11 years of boardrooms had built into his voice. She considered the question seriously, the way some people consider questions that matter to them rather than brushing them off with something easy. "My dad used to say there's 2 kinds of people in this world. People who see somebody struggling and wonder what's wrong with them, and people who see somebody struggling and wonder what happened to them." She shrugged, wiping her hands on her apron. "I try to be the second kind. Costs the diner a bowl of soup most nights. Worth it, far as I'm concerned. Your dad sounds like a good man." Something soft and complicated moved behind her eyes. "He is. Ornery as a mule most days, but good." She held out a hand. "Rosie. Rosalind technically, but nobody's called me that since my confirmation." He took her hand, calloused warm despite the late hour, a working hand, and found himself unable for one long, strange second to remember what name he had planned to give her. He had rehearsed it back at the office, standing in front of the mirror in Dutch's guest bathroom. Something simple. Something that wouldn't raise questions. "Gray," he said, finally, shaving the last syllable off his own name without quite deciding to. "Just Gray." "Well, Gray, eat your soup before it goes cold. I've got dishes to finish, but holler if you need anything." She moved off toward the kitchen, and Grady lowered his eyes back to the bowl in front of him, and it was then, in the low light slanting sideways from the counterlamp, that he saw it. A row of photographs pinned to a corkboard behind the register, faded at the edges, held up with mismatched thumbtacks, a birthday party, a graduation, a dog with its tongue out in front of a snowbank, and near the center, slightly larger than the rest, A photograph so old the color had gone soft and yellow at the corners. A boy, 16, maybe painfully thin, wrapped in a wool blanket several sizes too large, sat on the tailgate of a battered pickup truck, snow banked high behind him, a mug of something steaming clutched in two hands that looked almost blue with cold. Beside him stood a broad-shouldered man in a canvas coat, one hand resting on the boy's shoulder, with a gentleness that seemed even frozen in a photograph to carry weight. Grady's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. He knew that photograph. Not because he had seen it before, he hadn't. Not this exact print, not pinned to this exact corkboard, but because he had lived it. He knew the particular slouch of his own shoulders in that blanket. He knew with a certainty that dropped through his stomach like a stone through ice the exact cold of that January morning, the exact ache of thawing fingers, the exact sound of that man's voice saying, "You're safe now, son. Nobody's coming for you tonight." He had been that boy, and the man beside him, broad-shouldered, weathered, a scar catching the light along one eyebrow, was unmistakably, unforgettably a face Grady had carried in the back of his mind for 15 years, without ever learning the name that belonged to it. "Everything all right?" Rosie's voice from the counter pulled him back. Grady realized he had gone rigid, spoon suspended, staring across the room like a man who had seen a ghost, which was in some sense that made his chest ache exactly what had happened. "That photo," he said carefully, forcing his voice into something steadier than he felt. "Behind the register. Who's that with the boy?" Rosie glanced over her shoulder and something warm and a little sad moved across her face. The particular tenderness reserved for a story told many times. "That's my dad, Walt Hutchins. That picture's older than I am, practically. He found some kid half frozen out on County Road. 9/1 blizzard back before I was born. Well, I was a baby, don't really remember it. Brought him home, fed him, let him sleep in the barn loft till the roads cleared." She smiled, wiping the counter absently. "Dad still talks about him sometimes. Says he wonders whatever happened to that boy. Hopes somebody was as good to him later on as he tried to be that winter." Grady looked down at the soup in front of him, steam still rising, and found he could not for a long moment make himself speak at all. 15 years of distance collapsed suddenly into the space of a diner booth, into the smell of beef and barley, into a photograph, pinned crookedly to a corkboard by a young woman who had no idea she was looking at the very same boy grown, into the very same man now sitting 6 feet away from her, eating soup with shaking hands and a stolen name. "I'm sure he was," Grady said finally, very quietly, and did not trust himself to say anything more. The following morning came gray, and still the kind of Montana dawn that seems to hold its breath before deciding whether to snow. Grady Holt walked the 2 miles out past the edge of town on legs that ached from 3.5 nights of sleeping wherever the cold allowed, following directions Rosie had given him without quite meaning to give them out. Past the grain elevator. "Follow the fence line, you can't. Miss the barn. It's the red one." Or it used to be red until the Hutchins place came into view, across a stretch of frost-hardened pasture. It was smaller than he remembered. 15 years does that to a place a person only ever saw once in the dark, half-frozen and delirious with cold. Shrinks it down from the size of Salvation to the modest weathered dimensions of an ordinary Montana ranch house with peeling paint and a sagging porch step and a barn that had indeed once been red and was now more the color of rust. He stood at the edge of the fence for a long moment before he found the nerve to walk up the drive. Walt Hutchins was in the yard when Grady approached, bent over the engine of an ancient tractor with the patient muttering concentration of a man who had fixed the same machine 100 times and expected to fix it 100 more. He was older than the photograph, of course. He was 15 years older, gray, threading heavy through hair that had once been only touched with it, shoulders a little more stooped than they'd been carrying a half-frozen teenager across a snow-packed field. But it was him, unmistakably him. The same scar catching pale along one eyebrow, the same weathered, unhurried face. "Help you?" Walt asked, not unkindly, straightening up and wiping grease from his hands onto a rag hanging from his back pocket. His eyes moved over Grady, the way a rancher's eyes move over anything new on his land, assessing, careful, not unfriendly, but not yet trusting either. Grady's mouth had gone dry. He had rehearsed nothing for this moment. He had not truly believed until he was standing in the man's own yard that he would find the courage to come at all. "I was hoping I could do some work," Grady said, and the words came out smaller than he wanted them to, threadbare, the voice of a boy asking permission rather than a man who owned 4 ranches larger than this one combined. "In exchange for a meal. I don't need money." Walt studied him a long moment, the too thin coat, the hands chapped raw from cold, the particular hollow look of a man who has not eaten a proper meal in longer than he'd like to admit, and something in his weathered face softened. Not with pity, but with something closer to recognition, as though he were looking at a version of a memory he carried close. "Rosie mentioned you," Walt said finally. "Said you ate like you hadn't seen a hot meal in a week." He gestured toward the barn with his chin. "There's a fence line needs mending out past the north pasture. Cold work. You up for it?" "Yes, sir." They worked through the morning mostly in silence, Grady stringing wire with hands that remembered despite everything how to do this kind of labor. Remembered it from a childhood before Harold Holt, before glass towers and boardrooms, childhood he rarely let himself think about at all. Walt worked beside him without much talk, the comfortable quiet of a man used to his own company until they stopped near noon to share coffee from a battered thermos, steam curling up into air, cold enough to see their breath by. "You're not from around here," Walt said. It wasn't quite a question. "No, sir, not originally. Didn't think so. Something about the way you hold a fence tool. Like you learned it somewhere else a long time back and had to remember it fresh." Walt took a slow sip of coffee, eyes fixed on the middle distance on the pale line where the pasture met the sky. "Reminds me of somebody." Grady's chest tightened. "That so? Long time ago now. 15 years near enough." Walt's voice took on the particular cadence of a story worn smooth by frequent telling, the kind that had lost none of its weight for having been told 100 times. "Blizzard came through hard that January. Worst one I can remember, and I've seen a few. I was out checking on a heifer about to calve when I found a kid couldn't have been more than 16 walking County Road 9 like he had somewhere to be. Except it was 30 below with the wind chill and there wasn't a house for 6 miles in any direction." He shook his head slowly, half out of his mind with cold. Wouldn't say much. Wouldn't say where he came from, wouldn't say where he was headed, just kept saying he couldn't go back. Grady stared very hard at the fence wire in his hands, at the frost silvering the tips of his own fingers, and said nothing because he did not trust his voice not to break if he opened his mouth. "Brought him back here. Fed him. Let him sleep up in the barn loft near the wood stove we kept up there for the calving pens. Didn't ask him his name for 3 days, figured he'd tell me when he was ready." Walt's jaw worked slightly, an old grief moving under the surface of an old man's calm. Woke up on the 4th morning and he was gone. Just gone. Left the blanket folded up neat on the hay bale like he didn't want to be any trouble even leaving. He looked out at the pasture. At nothing in particular at 15 years of wondering. Never did find out what happened to him. Hope to God somebody else took him in the way I tried to. Hope he made something of himself wherever he ended up. "I did," Grady wanted to say. "You have no idea how much I made of myself. I built a company with your kindness sitting somewhere at the bottom of it like a foundation stone nobody else can see. I think about you more than I think about almost anyone alive." But he said none of it. Not yet. Not like this, kneeling in another man's pasture wearing another man's name, with Walt Hutchins looking 15 years older and considerably more tired than the broad-shouldered figure in that photograph. And Grady still not knowing, not truly, not in the marrow, whether the kindness that had saved his life once could survive the shock of learning who he had actually become. "Sounds like he was lucky. Grady managed finally to find you." Walt shrugged, the particular modest shrug of a man who has never once considered his own decency remarkable. "Wasn't luck. Just what you do when you find somebody cold and hungry on your land. Didn't used to be a hard choice to make back before the whole world got so scared of strangers." He capped the thermostat, offered Grady a hand up. "Anyhow, come on. Rosie'll have supper on soon and she'll skin me if I let a working man leave hungry." They walked back toward the house as the light began its early winter fade, the sky bruising slowly toward violet over the rim rocks, and Grady walked half a step behind the man who had once saved his life and could not recognize him now, and felt something in his chest that he had not expected, something equal parts, gratitude and grief, and a fierce, sudden, protective resolve. He did not know yet how he would tell them the truth. He knew only walking across that frost-hard pasture in the deepening dusk, that whatever it cost him he would not let this family fall. Not the daughter who fed strangers without asking their names, not the father who had once pulled a half-dead boy out of a snowbank and never once asked for anything in return. Whatever else happened, whatever the eventual reckoning of his real name and his real fortune, he would find some way to give this family back a fraction of what they had, without knowing it already given him. The porch light came on ahead of them, warm and yellow against the darkening blue, and somewhere inside Rosie was setting 3 plates instead of 2, humming something under her breath, entirely unaware that the stranger walking up her father's drive already loved this family more than he had loved anything in 15 years. Dutch Ryan almost didn't recognize the number when the phone buzzed against his kitchen counter well past 10 that night. It was the burner Dutch had pressed into Grady's hand 3 weeks earlier. half in relief and half in dread for emergencies only, and I mean it, and seeing it light up now unscheduled, unannounced, sent a cold thread of worry straight through Dutch's chest before he'd even answered. "Talk to me," Dutch said already, reaching for his truck keys. "I'm fine," Grady said quickly, hearing the fear in his friend's voice. "I'm fine, Dutch. I needed to hear a voice that knows who I actually am. Just for a minute." Dutch set the keys back down, slowly exhaled, and sank onto a stool at his kitchen island instead. "Okay, I'm here. What happened?" There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Dutch could hear wind moving somewhere behind Grady's breathing out in the open, still out in the cold wherever he'd found to sit that night. When Grady finally spoke, his voice had the careful, deliberate quality of a man setting down something heavy he had carried a very long way. "I found him, Dutch." "Found who?" "The man from the blizzard. 15 years ago. County Road 9. Grady's voice cracked slightly on the number on the memory folded inside it. "His name is Walt Hutchins. He's Rosie's father. The girl from the diner. The one I told you about." Dutch sat very still, feeling the shape of what that meant settle slowly over him. "Grady. He doesn't know it's me. I stood in his pasture today stringing fence wire using they, Inglai Finks wire, while he told me the whole story like it happened to somebody else, like I wasn't standing right there." Grady's breath caught ragged. "He still wonders what happened to me, Dutch. 15 years and he still wonders if I made it. If anybody was as good to me as he tried to be." Dutch closed his eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the silence carrying more between two old friends than words usually managed. "You never told me that part," Dutch said finally, gently. "Not really. Not the whole of it. I knew you ran away from Harold's from your first placement before he took you in. I never knew there was a blizzard involved. A barn. Somebody who actually—" He stopped himself, searching for the right word. "Somebody who actually saw you." "I never told anybody," Grady said. "Not even Harold. Especially not Harold." A bitter, exhausted laugh escaped him thin in the cold air. "You know what he told the reporters the first year he had me? Said he found me, his exact words, wandering without hope, without family, without anywhere to turn. Made it sound like an act of God. Like providence." Grady's voice went low and hard. "He never mentioned the barn. Never mentioned Walt. As far as the world knew, I materialized out of nothing straight into his living room, ready to be photographed." "Grady, let me finish. I need to say this out loud to somebody before it eats a hole straight through me." Grady's voice was steadier now, the steadiness of a man forcing himself forward through something that hurt with every step. "My mother, my real mother. Dutch, not the story that ran in the papers. She died the same night I ran. You know that part. You know Daniel Voss used to drink and use his hands on both of us. What you don't know is what happened right before she died." Dutch said nothing, only listened. The phone pressed hard against his ear as though proximity alone could carry some of the weight. "We were leaving," Grady said. "Finally. She'd saved almost $400 over 2 years, hidden it in a coffee can behind the water heater a little at a time so he'd never notice it missing. We were going to catch the 5 a.m. the bus out of town before he woke up." His voice thinned when almost boyish, the same register it had carried in the diner booth, asking Rosie, "Why are you doing this?" He woke up anyway. Came down the stairs while she was zipping my coat. She put herself between us, Dutch. Physically. Stood right in the doorway so I could get past her to the door. A long, unsteady breath. I heard what happened behind me while I was running. I was 11 years old, running down a dark street in November, and I heard it and I didn't go back, because she'd made me promise the last thing she ever said to me was run and don't stop no matter what you hear. Jesus, Grady. Dutch's own voice had gone rough. I ended up in the system after that. Bounced through 3 placements in 5 years, each one worse in its own particular way, until the third one, the man I told you about, got handsy enough that I finally just left. Walked out in January in Montana with nothing but the clothes on my back, because whatever waited for me out in that cold felt safer than what waited for me inside. Grady's breath shook audibly now. Walt Hutchins found me on that road 4 days later. Half dead. Didn't ask my name for 3 days. Just fed me, kept me warm, let me sleep by the stove in his barn like I was something worth keeping alive. He paused. "It's the only time in my whole childhood, Dutch, the only time that anybody took care of me and didn't want anything back for it. Not information, not gratitude, not a good photograph, just care, because I was cold and hungry, and that was reason enough." Dutch pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, throat tight. In 30 years of friendship, Grady had told him fragments enough to understand the shape of a hard childhood, enough to understand why Grady flinched almost imperceptibly whenever a stranger raised a hand too quickly near his face. Never the whole architecture of it laid bare in one unbroken confession. "And then Harold found you, Dutch," said quietly 4 days after that. 6 weeks after that, actually. I don't even know how I survived those 6 weeks hitchhiking, sleeping in truck stops, eating out of gas station dumpsters when I had to. By the time Harold's people found me half frozen outside a shelter in Billings, I'd have gone with anybody who offered a hot meal and a locked door. Grady's voice hardened old anger surfacing beneath old grief. It took me years to understand what he actually saw when he looked at me that first night. Not a child, a story. Orphan boy, hard upbringing, tragic and photogenic, a narrative he could build a political career on one gala dinner at a time. He fed me well, clothed me well, sent me to good schools, put me through business college, never once raised his voice or his hand to me. Grady exhaled long and slow, the sound of a wound being examined rather than reopened. But he never held me, Dutch. Not once in 11 years. Never asked how I was doing unless a reporter was standing 3 feet away. I was the best decision he ever made, and I don't think he ever once thought of me as anything more than that. A decision, not a son. "That's why you built all this," Dutch said slowly, understanding arriving in him like something long overdue. Not to prove something to the world. To prove you could be chosen for something other than being useful. I think Grady said very quietly, "I've spent my whole adult life believing love only comes to people who are worth something. That you have to earn it, be photogenic enough, successful enough, useful enough, or it doesn't come at all. Rosie's family is the first thing I've encountered in 15 years that doesn't run on that math." His voice caught raw and unguarded. Walt Hutchins pulled a stranger's kid out of a snowbank and asked for nothing back. Rosie fed a man she thought had nothing at all and gave anyway. I don't know what to do with that, Dutch. I don't have a category for it in my head. It scares me more than the cold ever did. Dutch sat in his dark kitchen for a long moment, listening to his oldest friend breathe unsteadily 2 miles away, in some frozen corner of the city, and understood with a clarity that settled heavy and permanent in his chest that whatever happened next, whatever this disguise cost Grady, whatever truths eventually had to surface at the Hutchins ranch, none of it would matter, as much as making sure Grady Holt finally learned in his bones and not just in his head, that he had never once needed to earn the right to be loved. "You're not a decision," Grady Dutch said, finally, voice thick. "You never were. You hear me?" There was a long silence on the line, the particular silence of a man crying quietly enough that he hopes it doesn't carry through the phone and then barely audible over the wind. "Yeah, I hear you." A few weeks slipped by the way winter weeks do, in Montana, slow in the bones and fast in the calendar. Each identical gray morning giving way to an identical gray dusk, snow falling and melting and falling again along the fence lines of Hutchins Ranch. Grady had become, without either of them quite naming it as such, a fixture there. Mornings mending fence with Walt, evenings drying dishes in Rosie's kitchen, while she hummed old country songs half under her breath. Some quiet, unspoken agreement settling between the three of them that this arrangement, however strange in its origins, had become something worth protecting. It was on one such evening, the kitchen warm with the smell of pot roast, and the windows fogged against the cold outside, that the porch light swept across gravel, and a car door slammed hard enough to rattle the dishes in the drying rack. "That'll be my Aunt Deb," Rosie said, and something tightened at the corner of her mouth that Grady had not seen there before. Not fear exactly, but the particular bracing a person does before a familiar kind of weather. Deborah Hutchins came through the door without knocking, the way people only do in houses they consider partly their own, shaking snow from a coat that cost. Grady's practiced eye noted, without meaning to, considerably more than anything else in the room. She stopped short at the sight of him standing at the sink, dish towel in hand, and her face did something swift and unflattering. A flicker of assessment, dismissal, distaste, gone almost as fast as it arrived, replaced by a smile too bright to be sincere. "Well," Deb said, "I didn't realize we had company." "Aunt Deb, this is Gray," Rosie said, drying her hands on her apron. "He's been helping Dad around the place." "Has he?" Deb's eyes moved over him once more, cataloging the worn jacket, the calloused hands, the plain and unremarkable face of a man, with, as far as she could tell, absolutely nothing to recommend him. "How generous of you, Rosalind, taking in strays." She said it lightly, as though it were a joke, though nothing in her face suggested humor. Grady said nothing, only excused himself with a quiet nod, and stepped out onto the porch to give the family whatever this was about to be, though the cold outside did little to blunt what carried clearly enough through the thin kitchen window. "I need to talk to you, Deb," said her voice, dropping into something more urgent now that she believed herself unheard. "About Chip." "Aunt Deb, he called me again today, Rosalind. Chip Preston, do you understand what that family is worth? Do you have any idea what it would mean for this family, for your father, for this ranch, for the mortgage I know good and well, is 3 months behind because your father won't ask anybody for help? How do you know about the mortgage? Because I talked to the bank because somebody in this family has to think ahead instead of just getting by on faith and stubbornness. Deb's voice climbed sharp with a frustration that seemed beneath its edges to carry something almost like fear for the people she was scolding. Chip Preston is offering to court you properly, Rosalind. His family's oil money could fix everything wrong with this place inside a year. And instead you're out here drying dishes for some drifter you picked up off the street. His name is Gray. And he's not a project, Aunt Deb. He's Rosie's voice caught searching for a word she hadn't fully examined yet, even to herself. He's a good man. I don't know everything about him, but I know that. You don't know anything about him, Deb said, and the words landed with the particular cruelty of someone who believes sincerely that she is only stating fact. You don't know his last name. You don't know where he's from, what he ran from, whether he's dangerous, whether he's using you, he's not using me. That's what every woman thinks right up until she's the one holding the bag. Deb's voice softened, suddenly dropping the sharpness for something almost pleading, almost tender in its own misguided way. Honey, I watched my sister, your mother, marry for love and bury herself in worry over money for 18 years before the cancer took her. I am not going to stand by and watch her daughter do the exact same thing with her eyes wide open. Chip is offered to you. Do you understand how rare that is? A man like that choosing a girl like you. Outside on the porch, Grady stood very still and the cold hands jammed deep in his jacket pockets and felt each sentence land somewhere just beneath his ribs. A drifter you picked up off the street. You don't know anything about him. He thought of 11 years of boardrooms of a company with his name carved into marble, of more money than this entire county's property values combined, sitting quietly in accounts he had not touched once, since the day he'd walked out into the cold, and understood with a bitterness that surprised him by how sharp it still was that none of it would matter to Deborah Hutchins. If she knew, because right now in this kitchen all she could see was the coat, the hands, the absence of a story she found acceptable. I love him, Aunt Deb, Rosie said, quiet but unshaking, and something in Grady's chest went very still and very warm at once, hearing it spoken plainly for the first time, even secondhand, even through a window pane. I don't have proof of it the way you want proof. I just know how I feel when he's in the room, and I know how I feel when Chip Preston is in the room, and those are two very different things. Feelings don't pay a mortgage. No, Rosie said, but they're worth more than one some days. Deb sighed long and frustrated, the sigh of a woman who has run out of arguments but not out of worry. Just meet him. Chip. One dinner. That's all I'm asking. If you still feel the same way after, I'll drop it. A pause softer. I'm not trying to hurt you, Rosalind. I'm trying to make sure somebody in this family finally gets to stop struggling. There was a long silence in the kitchen, long enough that Grady, standing on the porch with his breath fogging pale in the porch light, found himself holding his own breath along with it. One dinner, Rosie said finally, and Grady heard the reluctance in it, heard too the impossible bind of a daughter who loved her aunt and did not want the argument to cost her that love, even while every other part of her clearly wanted to refuse outright. One. And then you let it go. Deb's relief was audible even through the glass, a small triumphant exhale, and moments later the porch light swept again as her car pulled away down the long gravel drive, red taillights shrinking into the dark. Grady came back inside to find Rosie standing at the sink again, hands braced on the edge of its shoulders, drawn up tight around her ears in a way that made her look for a moment much younger than she was. You heard all that she said. It wasn't a question. Some of it. He hesitated, then added quieter. Enough of it. She turned to face him, and there was something raw and apologetic in her expression, though she had nothing to apologize for. She's not wrong about the money. Dad won't say it, but we're close to losing this place. I've seen the letters he thinks he's hidden well enough. Her voice wavered. I know what dinner with Chip Preston is supposed to be. A door opening. A way to save everything Dad spent his whole life building. And what does it feel like to you? Grady asked, and his voice came out lower than he meant it to, rougher, carrying more than the question alone. Rosie looked at him for a long moment, something searching and unguarded in her face, the particular look of a woman standing at the edge of a decision she has not fully admitted to herself yet. It feels, she said slowly, like a door I don't want to walk through, even if it leads somewhere safe. She wiped her hands on her apron, an old nervous habit. But I don't know how to explain to my aunt that safety isn't the only thing worth choosing for. Not when it costs this much. Grady wanted more than he had wanted almost anything in 15 years, to tell her the truth. Right then, to say, you don't have to choose between love and the mortgage, Rosie. I could clear that debt with a single phone call and never miss the money, and felt the shape of that confession rise in his throat and stop there, caught behind 11 years of learning exactly how fast people changed once they knew what he was worth. Not yet, he told himself. Not like this. Not with Deb's warning still hanging fresh in the air between them. You don't know anything about him. A warning that was in its own way more true than Deb Hutchins could possibly have understood. Whatever you decide, Grady said instead, quiet and careful. I hope it's because it's what you actually want, not because anybody made it feel like the only door left open. Rosie looked at him a long moment, something unspoken passing between them in the fogged kitchen light, and nodded once slowly, as though filing the sentence away somewhere she intended to return to later, not yet knowing how soon and how painfully that door and this one would collide. The first real snow of the season fell that Thursday night, thick and silent, blanketing the Hutchins ranch, in a white so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Grady stood at the barn door near dusk, watching it come down in slow diagonal sheets against the yard light, and felt something in his chest ease for the first time in days. The particular peace that only ever seemed to find him here on this land among these two people who had no idea what he actually was. He did not know yet that this would be the night everything changed. Rosie found him there, a mug of coffee in each hand, snow settling in her hair before she'd gone 10 steps from the porch. She handed him one without a word and stood beside him at the barn door, both of them watching the snow come down over the pasture, over the dark shapes of cattle huddled near the tree line, over a world gone quiet and soft at its edges. Dad got another letter today, she said, finally, her voice carefully, even the tone of someone who has practiced saying a hard thing calmly enough times that the calm has become its own kind of armor. From the bank. 90 days this time. That's it. 90 days or they start foreclosure. Grady's hand tightened slightly around the mug. Rosie, I'm not telling you so you'll feel sorry for us. She cut him off gently, shaking her head. I'm telling you because I need to tell somebody, and my dad won't talk about it, and Aunt Deb only talks about it to make her case for Chip Preston, and you're. She stopped, searching for the word, and something in her face went soft and a little embarrassed. You're the only person who just listens without trying to fix it or use it. They stood in silence, a while longer, snow gathering on their shoulders, the barn light throwing a warm yellow square out onto the white ground. I have something to show you, Rosie said eventually, and led him inside the barn up the same wooden ladder Grady had climbed once before 15 years ago, half frozen and delirious, into the same hayloft where a stove still stood cold and unused in the corner. She knelt beside an old trunk pushed against the wall, and from beneath a folded horse blanket pulled out a battered tin, the kind that had once held Christmas cookies decades ago. Its painted holly faded nearly to nothing, its hinges rusted soft with age. This was my mom's, Rosie said, prying the lid open with careful fingers. Inside, folded and rolled and rubber-banded into small, tight bundles, was cash. Not a fortune, not by the standards Grady was accustomed to, but clearly the accumulation of years of small sacrifices made one at a time, tip jars and overtime, shifts, and Christmases skipped in favor of savings. $6,200. Took me almost 4 years. She held it out to him with both hands, the way a person offers something sacred. I want you to have it. Grady stared at the tin as though it might burn him. Rosie, no. Absolutely not. Please. Her voice wavered, but her hands stayed steady, still extended, still offering. You've been sleeping, God knows where, for weeks. You need to start something, get a place, get on your feet, whatever it is you're trying to build back up. I don't know your whole story, Gray, but I know you're a good man who's had something terrible happen to him, and I have this sitting in a barn doing nothing except making me feel less alone with a secret my dad doesn't even know I've kept. This is your future, Grady said, and his voice had gone rough, thick, with something he was fighting hard not to let surface fully. This is the mortgage. This is 90 days, Rosie. It's $6,000 against a debt that's $40,000 behind, she said quietly. It's not going to save this ranch either way, but it might save you. Her eyes, steady and clear despite the tears gathering at their edges, held his. My dad taught me that when you see somebody fallen, you give what you have. Not what's convenient, not what you can spare and not miss. What you have. He lived that his whole life. I want to live it too. Grady looked down at the tin, at the small, tight bundles of a woman's 4-year sacrifice, and felt something inside him crack wide open. Not sorrow exactly, though there was plenty of that, but something closer to reverence, the particular ache of witnessing a goodness so unguarded. It had no idea it was rare. I can't take this, he said, but his hands were already closing slowly around the tin. Some instinct beyond his own reasoning. understanding that refusing it outright would wound her more deeply than accepting it ever could, that this gift was not really about the money at all, but about being allowed to give it, about proving to herself in the dark of a snow-heavy night that love could still be offered without any guarantee of return. "You can," Rosie said softly, "and you will, because I'm asking you to let me do this one good thing without arguing me out of it." They sat together in the hayloft a long while after that, snow ticking softly against the barn roof, the tin sitting between them like something holy, and Grady made a silent vow that he did not yet know how to keep without breaking the fragile trust they'd built, that whatever it cost him, whatever the eventual reckoning, he would find a way to give this family back not $6,000 but everything. The ranch, the mortgage, the whole weight Rosie had carried alone in this loft for years, believing no one else knew. "Can I ask you something?" Rosie said, breaking the silence, her voice smaller now, more uncertain than he'd ever heard it. "Anything. Where do you go, Gray, at night? When you leave here?" She wasn't looking at him now, studying instead the faded holly on the tin's lid. "I've never asked, because I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. But it's getting colder and I keep lying awake wondering if you're warm enough, and I—" She stopped, cheeks coloring slightly even in the dim lamplight. "I just worry about you. More than I probably should for somebody I've known such a short time." Grady felt the confession rise in his throat again, sharper this time, more insistent, the truth of who he was, what he was worth, why none of this should have to be a sacrifice on her part at all. He looked at her face in the low light, open and worried and utterly without calculation, and understood that the moment to tell her was very nearly here, close enough to touch, and that he was still, despite everything, too afraid of what her face might do when the truth landed. "Somewhere close," he said instead, which was not quite a lie. "Somewhere I can watch the road to make sure nothing happens to this place at night." That much at least was entirely true. He had taken, without telling her, to sleeping in the lee of the equipment shed near the drive, close enough to hear a car approach, close enough to be sure Chip Preston's men, whatever they might be, capable of, would find no easy opening. Rosie studied him a moment longer, something unresolved and searching in her expression, and then let it go, the way a person lets go of a question they suspect has a longer answer than they're ready for yet. "Take the tin," she said instead, closing his hands more firmly around it. "Please. Let me do this." He did, and walking back out into the snow a while later, the tin heavy and sacred in his coat pocket, Grady Holt, billionaire cattle king, a man who had once signed a single contract worth more than this entire county's annual income, found himself crying for the first time in longer than he could remember, standing alone in a snow-blanketed pasture, overwhelmed by $6,200 that had cost a young woman 4 years of her life, and understanding, with a clarity that nearly buckled his knees, that he had never in his adult life been given anything that meant this much. The call came through on the burner phone just after 6 the next morning, while frost still crusted thick on the equipment shed window, and Grady sat huddled against its wall in the gray pre-dawn light, the cookie tin still tucked deep in his coat pocket where it had stayed all night too, precious to let out of reach. "You sound different," Dutch said when Grady picked up. "Good different. Bad different. I can't tell yet." "I need you to do something for me," Grady said, "and I need you to do it quietly. No paper trail that leads back to Holt cattle. Nothing that can be traced to me at all." Dutch's voice sharpened instantly, all business. Now the tone he used when a deal was moving fast and needed careful handling. "Talk. Walt Hutchins is 90 days from foreclosure. First Prairie Bank of Billings holds the note. I want it bought." Grady's voice was steady now, stripped of the raw emotion of the night before, replaced by the particular calm of a man who has finally found somewhere to put 15 years of unpaid debt. "Not forgiven. Bought. Quietly through a shell, something with no connection to my name. Nothing that traces back further than a generic holding company. I don't care what it costs." There was a pause on the line, the sound of Dutch presumably sitting up straighter at whatever desk he'd been slumped over. "Grady, that's not a small ask. Banks don't just sell paper on a whim, especially not on a property that's still—" "Then find the leverage. You've done harder deals than this before breakfast." Grady's voice cracked just slightly at the edges. "Dutch, this family pulled me out of a snowbank 15 years ago, and never once thought to ask what it might cost them. I have more money sitting untouched in accounts than this entire county sees in a decade, and I am not going to stand by and watch them lose everything over $40,000 while I sleep in their equipment shed feeling grateful." "Okay," Dutch said, quieter now, some of the business-like edge softening into something closer to understanding. "Okay, I'll make some calls today. There's a regional office 2 counties over. I know somebody there went to school with his sister. I can probably get this done through a holding company registered out of Wyoming. Nobody connects Wyoming paperwork back to a Montana beef company, unless they're specifically looking, and nobody's going to be specifically looking at a diner waitress's mortgage. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to take a few weeks to do right, and if you're planning to keep playing homeless man in a barnyard that whole time, you're going to owe me considerably more than gratitude by the time this is finished. A pause and then gentler. How are you doing, really? You sounded like you'd been crying first 30 seconds of this call. Grady looked down at the tin still sitting heavy in his coat pocket. Thought of Rosie's steady hands extending it toward him in the lamplight. Thought of 4 years of a young woman's small sacrifices folded into rubber-banded bundles. She gave me everything she had, Dutch. $6,000. 4 years of saving and she just handed it over. Didn't ask what I'd do with it. Didn't ask for anything back. His voice caught. I don't think I've ever been given anything without strings in my whole adult life. Not once. Not from Harold, not from the board, not from a single person who wasn't first calculating what it might cost or earn them. And now you're going to quietly erase her family's entire financial nightmare and never tell her it was you. Yes, that's a hell of a way to say thank you, Dutch said, and there was something warm underneath the dry humor, now something that had not been there the first weeks of this whole endeavor. You know, eventually you're going to have to tell her the truth. About all of it. The mortgage, the name, everything. She's going to find out one way or another, and it matters a great deal whether she hears it from you or from a headline. I know. Grady closed his eyes, the cold biting sharp against his face despite the shed's thin shelter. I just need a little more time. I need to know what this feels like a little longer before it changes into something she has to be careful around. Once she knows what I'm worth, Dutch, nothing about how she treats me will ever be simple again. Even if she doesn't mean for it to change. It always changes. Understood. Dutch's voice turned businesslike again, but gently, so a friend easing back into the practical work of protecting someone he loved. I'll have the paperwork moving by end of week. It'll look like a standard debt acquisition, nothing unusual. The kind regional banks do all the time when they want smaller notes off their books before year-end reporting. Walt gets a letter in a few weeks saying his loan's been transferred to new servicing terms adjusted favorably, balance reduced. Won't raise a single eyebrow. Reduced how much, however much you want, Grady. It's your money. Grady thought about it only a moment. All of it. Zero balance. Clear title. Dutch exhaled slowly on the other end of the line, something like awe threading through the sound. That's $41,000, near enough, just gone. No fanfare, no thank you, no way for them to ever trace it back and repay you, even if they wanted to. That's the point, Grady said quietly. I don't want it repaid. I want it to have never been a burden they had to carry alone in the first place. They spoke a while longer about logistics. The shell company's name, the false paper trail, the careful choreography required to make an act of profound generosity look from the outside like nothing more than routine banking, and by this time Grady ended the call. The sun had begun to crest weakly over the rim rocks, pale gold light spilling thin across the frosted pasture, catching on every crystal of ice along the fence wire, until the whole field seemed briefly improbably made of glass. He walked back toward the barn a while later, the tin still in his pocket, and found Walt already up and working breath-fogging as he forked hay into the feeder for a small huddle of cattle near the gate. You're up early, Walt said without looking over. Couldn't sleep. Walt grunted, the particular grunt of a man who had spent a lifetime not asking questions he suspected people weren't ready to answer. They worked together in silence for a while, forking hay, breaking ice on the water trough. The ordinary rhythms of ranch labor settling something in Grady's chest that 11 years of boardrooms had never once managed to touch. You've been good to us, Walt said, eventually not looking up from his work. More than you had to be for a man passing through with nothing to gain by staying. You were good to somebody once, Grady said carefully, who never got the chance to properly thank you for it. Maybe I'm just paying it forward on his behalf. Walt paused, leaning on the fork a moment, something thoughtful crossing his weathered face. Funny thing to say. Is it? Suppose it is a little. Walt studied him a long moment, the same careful, unhurried assessment Grady remembered from that first day in the yard, and for one suspended second, Grady thought, hoped, feared that the old man might finally see through 15 years and a stranger's name to the boy he'd once wrapped in a blanket on a January morning. But Walt only shook his head slowly, some private thought settling back beneath the surface, and returned to his work. Rosie thinks a lot of you, you know. More than she said out loud, probably. She's careful with her heart, that girl. Had to learn to be after her mother passed. Don't take that lightly, whoever you turn out to be underneath all that quiet. I don't, Grady said. and his voice broke slightly on the words more than he intended it to. "I don't take any of it lightly, Walt. I promise you that." Walt studied him a moment longer, something almost knowing flickering behind his tired eyes, and then nodded once, accepting the answer without pressing further, the same patient, undemanding grace he had shown a half-frozen 16-year-old 15 years before, asking nothing, offering everything, content to let the truth surface in its own time. Neither of them spoke of it again that morning, but something had shifted in the frozen air between them, quiet and unmistakable, the way ice sometimes shifts beneath a thaw long before the surface shows any visible crack. And 3 weeks later, a letter would arrive from a bank in Wyoming that neither Walt nor Rosie had ever heard of, informing them, in the flat, bureaucratic language of routine finance, that the note on the Hutchins ranch had been paid in full. 3 weeks later, the letter from Wyoming arrived at the Hutchins mailbox on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, and Rosie read it twice at the kitchen table before she trusted her own eyes, before she called her father in from the barn to read it a third time over her shoulder, both of them silent for a long stretch afterward, disbelief settling slowly into something neither of them had words for yet. They did not know who to thank. Grady, sitting quietly at the far end of the table with a mug of coffee he could not manage to lift to his mouth without his hand trembling, said nothing at all and let them wonder. It was that same week that Chip Preston's patience already finally ran out. He had not liked the rumors filtering back to him through Deb Hutchins that Rosalind's mind seemed made up, that some drifter had somehow embedded himself deep enough in the family's daily life, that even Walt had started speaking of him with something close to affection. Chip Preston did not lose things gracefully. He had built a public image on winning, on never once appearing to want something he did not eventually get, and a diner waitress choosing a homeless man over an oil family's heir was precisely the kind of story that could not be allowed to spread past the county line. He made a phone call. He was careful about the wording. Careful enough, he believed, to leave no trace back to himself at all. Grady never saw the truck coming. He was walking the county road just past dusk, cutting the same route he'd walked nearly every evening for weeks back toward the equipment shed where he slept. The cookie tin's absence in his coat pocket returned gently, refused, folded instead into an envelope of cash he'd left anonymously in Rosie's church collection basket the previous Sunday, still sitting strange and hollow against his ribs. Headlights swelled suddenly behind him, too fast, too close, swerving hard onto the shoulder, exactly as he turned. He remembered impact more than he remembered pain, the terrible weightless instant of being airborne, the ditch rising up to meet him, the truck's engine roaring away into the dark without slowing. He remembered distantly, a boot connecting with his ribs, once, twice, a voice, low and unhurried above him, saying something about staying away from things that don't belong to you, before the world tilted sideways into a gray, ringing silence. Rosie found him 40 minutes later. She had been driving back from the pharmacy in town, headlights cutting thin cones through the dark, when they caught something pale and unmoving in the ditch grass along County Road 9. The same road, though she did not yet know to feel the weight of that coincidence, where her father had once found another half-frozen stranger 15 years before. Gray. Her voice tore raw as she scrambled down the embankment, mud soaking through her jeans, hands shaking as they found his face, his throat, the frantic search for a pulse. Gray, oh God, Gray, stay with me, stay with me. He was conscious, barely, one eye swelling shut, blood dark against the snow beneath his cheek. He tried to speak and managed only her name, thin and broken, before his eyes rolled back, and he went still in a way that made Rosie scream for help into a dark, empty road with no one to hear her. She got him into the truck bed somehow, adrenaline lending her a strength she would not remember having later, when she tried to reconstruct the night and drove faster than she had ever driven in her life, one hand on the wheel and the other reaching back constantly to check that he was still, breathing all the way to Billings Clinic tires, screaming into the ambulance bay as she threw the truck into park and ran inside, screaming for help. He's hurt. He's really hurt. Please, somebody help him. Orderlies swarmed the truck bed within seconds, lifting Grady onto a gurney with the brisk efficiency of people trained for exactly this. Rosie running alongside as they wheeled him through the automatic doors into the harsh fluorescent light of the emergency department, still shouting his name, still gripping his hand until a nurse gently pried her fingers loose at the trauma bay curtain. She stood there afterward, shaking blood, his blood dried dark across her palms, and waited. It was perhaps 20 minutes later that the attending physician emerged from behind the curtain, clipboard in hand, and stopped short at the sight of the patient's face, now cleaned of enough blood to be recognizable, and went very, very still. Get me Dr. Alvarez, the physician said quietly to the nearest nurse. an edge of urgency entering his voice that had nothing to do with the injuries alone. Now. And somebody call administration. Immediately. Rosie, still standing numb and blood-streaked near the nurse's station, did not understand the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, the way voices dropped low, the way a hospital administrator appeared within minutes, still buttoning his jacket, clearly summoned from home, hurrying down the corridor with an urgency reserved for very particular kinds of patients. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked, catching the administrator's sleeve as he passed. "Please, is he?" The administrator stopped, looked at her properly for the first time, taking in the blood on her hands, the raw terror in her face, and something in his expression softened with confusion before he spoke. "Ma'am, are you here with Mr. Holt?" The word landed strange and unfamiliar in the sterile hallway. "Who?" "Mr. Holt," the administrator repeated, gesturing toward the curtain where Grady lay being examined. "Grady Holt. He's a member of our hospital board, ma'am. The entire East Wing renovation 2 years ago was funded through the Holt Family Foundation." He studied her face, clearly reading confusion where he had expected recognition, and his own expression shifted into something careful, almost apologetic. "You didn't know." The words did not fully land at first. Rosie stood very still, the fluorescent light suddenly too bright, the antiseptic smell of the hallway suddenly too sharp, every sound in the corridor arriving strange and distant, as though she were hearing it all from underwater. "That's not," she started and stopped because the sentence had nowhere true to go. "That's not possible. He doesn't have anything. He sleeps in a..." She stopped again, the ground shifting beneath a version of events she had believed completely for weeks, every small kindness she had extended reorganizing itself suddenly into something she no longer understood. A nurse hurried past, calling back over her shoulder to a colleague. "Get the chairman a private room, quiet floor, and somebody notify the board before this hits the local news." The chairman. Rosie's knees buckled slightly and she caught herself against the wall, the corridor tilting sideways around her the way the world tilts in the instant before a fall. She thought of the $11 he'd carried the night they met. The soup she'd given him free, quietly proud of her own small generosity. The cookie tin, 4 years of saved tips, of skipped meals, of careful sacrifice pressed into hands that she now understood with a nausea rising sharp in her throat, had never once actually needed it. She thought of her father wondering aloud in the pasture about a boy from 15 years ago, never once suspecting the man eating supper at his table 3 nights a week already knew the answer. She thought of the mortgage, paid in full. No explanation. No return address. Oh God, she thought, the pieces slamming together with a violence that made the hallway spin harder. Oh my God, it was him. It was him the whole time. "Ma'am," the administrator's voice reached her from very far away. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need to sit down?" Rosie did not answer. She stood frozen in the fluorescent corridor of Billings Clinic, blood dried dark on her hands, staring at a curtain behind which lay a man whose real name she had never once thought to ask, a man she had fed and trusted and given everything she had, only to learn in the space of a single sentence, spoken by a stranger in a hospital hallway, that he had been letting her believe a lie every single day since the night she'd handed him a bowl of hot soup and asked for nothing in return. Somewhere behind that curtain, Grady Holt regained consciousness, slowly, pain bright and insistent through his ribs, and heard through the thin fabric divider the unmistakable sound of Rosie's breath catching hard and ragged in the hallway outside, and understood with a dread far sharper than any pain the beating had left behind that the truth had finally found her before he'd ever found the courage to give it to her himself. The private room they moved him to overlooked the parking lot, sterile and quiet, the kind of room reserved for people whose names carried weight in a building's ledgers. Grady lay against the raised bed with 2 cracked ribs bound tight beneath his hospital gown, a bruise blooming dark purple along his jaw, and stared at the ceiling tiles, as though they might offer some answer he had not managed to find in 15 years of practicing exactly this confession, and never once delivering it. Rosie had not come back through the curtain. He had heard her voice fracture in the hallway, heard the particular silence that followed worse than any sound could have been, and then nothing. No footsteps returning. No hand finding his again the way it had in the ditch grass, the way it had held on through the frantic drive that likely saved his life. Just the low murmur of hospital machinery, and somewhere far off a door closing with the soft final click of someone choosing to leave. Dutch arrived within the hour, having driven the 2 hours from a supplier meeting in Great Falls the moment the hospital's automated alert system, the one that flagged any incident involving board members, reached his phone. He came through the door still in his travel coat, face pale, with the particular fear of a man who has spent 30 years half expecting the phone call that finally comes. You look like hell, Dutch said, some of the fear leaving his voice the moment he confirmed with his own eyes that Grady was at least alive and speaking. Feels about right. Grady's voice was thin, wrecked, and not entirely from the ribs. Dutch, she knows. Dutch went still. How? The hospital staff. The administrator. Grady closed his eyes. I never got the chance to tell her myself. She heard it from a stranger in a hallway with my blood still on her hands from pulling me out of a ditch. His voice cracked. 15 years I've imagined telling her the truth on my own terms in my own words, and instead she found out the exact way I always feared she would, like I'd been lying to her the whole time. Because I had been, even if I never meant it as a lie. Where is she now? Gone. I don't know where. She didn't come back. Dutch pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down heavily, rubbing a hand over his face, the exhaustion of the drive and the fear finally catching up to him now that the immediate danger had passed. I need to handle the press angle before this becomes a headline by morning hit-and-run assault on a Fortune list name is exactly the kind of story that writes itself. But that's not what you're actually worried about right now, is it? No. Okay. Dutch exhaled slowly. Then let's talk about what actually matters. You're going to have to go to her. Not call. Not send somebody. You in person the moment they release you from this bed, and you're going to tell her every single thing you should have told her 3 weeks ago. What if she won't see me? Then you stand outside that ranch house in the cold until she decides whether she wants to. Dutch said with a flatness that left no room for argument. You've done harder things than wait, Grady. You slept in a barnyard for a month to prove a point to yourself. You can survive standing on a porch. Grady turned his face toward the window, toward the gray Montana afternoon light falling flat across the parking lot, and said nothing for a long moment. I keep thinking about what she'll believe now, he said finally, voice low. That everything was some kind of test. That I was watching her, judging her, deciding whether she passed. That's not what it was, Dutch. I wasn't testing her. I was just starving for something real, and she was the first real thing I'd found in years. But how do I explain that in a way that doesn't sound exactly like the manipulation she probably thinks it was? You tell her the truth, all of it, and you let her decide what to believe once she's heard it, Dutch said. That's the only thing you actually have any control over. Across town at the Hutchins Ranch, Rosie sat at the kitchen table long after dark, the letter from the Wyoming bank spread out in front of her again, reading the words with new eyes, note paid in full balance, zero clear title and feeling. Something in her chest twist tighter with every line. Walt found her there near midnight, unable to sleep himself, and lowered himself into the chair across from her with the careful movements of a tired old body. You want to tell me what happened at that hospital, he said. Or you want me to keep guessing from the half a story Deb already heard from somebody at the diner? He's rich, Dad. Rosie's voice came out flat, hollowed of the anger that had carried her through the drive home, leaving behind only something exhausted and raw. Not comfortable. Not doing okay, rich. Board of the hospital funds. The East Wing rich. His name is Grady Holt. He owns Holt Cattle Co. She looked up, eyes red-rimmed. He's been eating at our table for a month, letting us believe he had nothing, and this whole time. She stopped, unable to finish, and Walt sat very still across from her, something moving slowly behind his weathered face. Not shock quite, but a careful, deliberate processing, the particular stillness of a man turning a puzzle piece over in his hands and beginning slowly to recognize its shape. Holt, Walt said quietly, almost to himself. Grady, you know the name. Heard it. Everybody around here's heard it. Walt rubbed a hand slowly over his jaw. Eyes distant, now moving through some private calculation Rosie could not follow. How old a man is he? What's he look like exactly under all that dust and worn-out coat? Why does that matter right now? Just answer me, Rosalind. Something in his tone, quiet, urgent, entirely unlike his usual unhurried calm, made her answer without further argument. 31. Maybe 32. Dark hair. She stopped, throat tightening at a memory she hadn't examined until this exact moment. There's a scar on his wrist. Old one. I never asked about it. Walt's face went very pale, very still, and for a long moment he did not speak at all, staring at some point on the table between them as though it had opened onto 15 years all at once. Dad, the mortgage, Walt said slowly. Paid in full. No warning. No name attached. His voice had gone strange, unsteady, moving toward a conclusion. He seemed almost afraid to speak aloud. And a scar on the wrist. What are you talking about? Walt looked up at her then, and something in his eyes had cracked open entirely, grief and hope and disbelief, all tangled together at once. The particular expression of a man who has wondered about something for 15 years and suddenly, impossibly glimpsed the shadow of an answer. Rosalind, he said, voice thick. I think I need you to tell me everything. Every single thing that man ever said to me. Because I think God help me, I think I might know exactly who he is. And it isn't just some rich man who happened to wander onto our land. Outside, the wind picked up hard against the windows, rattling the old glass in its frame, and somewhere across town in a sterile hospital room, Grady Holt lay awake, staring at the ceiling, entirely unaware that the truth he had been too afraid to speak was at that very moment assembling itself piece by piece at the kitchen table of the only family who had ever loved him without asking what it might cost them. Grady checked himself out of Billings clinic against doctor's orders. 2 mornings later, ribs still wrapped tight beneath his shirt, a fading yellow-purple bruise mapped along his jaw, and drove Dutch's truck the long way out of town toward County Road 9. The same stretch of gravel, where 15 years apart 2 different versions of himself had nearly died in a ditch and twice been pulled out by hands that asked for nothing in return. He did not call ahead. He was not sure, driving out through a thin gray drizzle that hadn't quite decided to become snow, that he deserved the courtesy of a warning, or that Rosie would answer a phone even if he tried. Walt was waiting on the porch when the truck came up, the long gravel drive not working, not pretending to be occupied with some chore, just standing at the rail with his arms crossed, and his gaze fixed on the road, the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for something a very long time, and has finally at last been told it might be arriving. Grady climbed out slowly, favoring his ribs, and stood at the base of the porch steps with his hands loose and open at his sides, offering nothing to hide behind. "Walt, Come here," Walt said, and his voice broke clean in half on the second word. Grady climbed the steps, and Walt reached out and gripped his forearm. Not a handshake, not yet, but something rougher and more urgent fingers, finding the old scar along Grady's wrist and pressing against it as though needing the physical proof beneath his own hand before he could trust anything else. He turned Grady's wrist gently toward the gray daylight, studied the faded white line there, a mark from a barn nail 15 years old. Gotten the very week Walt had pulled him half-frozen off the road, and something in the old man's face simply gave way. "It's you," Walt said, voice raw. "God in heaven. It's you." "Yes, sir." Grady's own voice cracked. "It's me." Walt pulled him into an embrace. Then, careful of the ribs, once Grady flinched but fierce. Despite the care, one broad hand pressed flat against the back of Grady's head, the way it might rest on the head of a boy far younger than the man. Standing on his porch now, 15 years compressed into a single held breath, into the particular silence of a debt neither of them had ever expected to be able to settle, finally settling itself without either of them having to find the words. "I looked for you," Walt said, pulling back at last, eyes bright and unashamed. "Not hard, not the way I should have, but I asked around some that first year. Nobody knew anything. I figured I don't know what I figured, that you'd found your way somewhere better or you hadn't, and either way it wasn't mine to keep chasing after a boy who'd made it clear he needed to run." His hand tightened once more on Grady's shoulder. 15 years. And here you were, sitting at my table 3 nights a week, mending my fences, letting me tell you your own story like you were a stranger to it. "I didn't know how to tell you," Grady said. "I didn't know how to walk up and say, I'm the boy from the blizzard, and also I'm worth more money than this whole county. And also I lied to your daughter about both of those things for a month." There wasn't a version of that sentence that didn't sound like a betrayal. It was one Rosie said from the doorway. Grady turned. She stood just inside the screen door, arms crossed tight over her chest, eyes red-rimmed from what looked like 2 sleepless nights, her face carrying an exhaustion that went deeper than tiredness alone. She did not step out onto the porch. "It was a betrayal," she said again, steadier this time. "However good your reasons were, however kind you actually are underneath it. I fed you. I gave you money I saved for 4 years because I thought you had nothing, and the whole time you had everything gray. Grady." She said the real name like it still didn't fit right in her mouth. "You had everything, and you let me believe otherwise, and I need you to understand that it doesn't matter how good your intentions were. It still hurt like a lie." "I know," Grady said quietly. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you it wasn't a lie, because it was, and you deserve better than me pretending it wasn't." He climbed the last step, stopping a careful distance from her, close enough to speak plainly, far enough not to crowd whatever space she needed. "But I need you to hear the whole of why, Rosie. Not as an excuse. Just as the truth finally, all of it the way I should have given it to you from the start." She said nothing, but she did not close the door either. He told her everything standing there on the porch with the gray drizzle finally thickening toward snow. He told her about his mother, about the coffee can behind the water heater, about running down a dark street at 11 years old with his mother's last words ringing in his ears. He told her about the placements after, about the man whose hands had finally driven him out into a Montana January with nothing but the clothes on his back. He told her about her father finding him on this very road, about the barn loft, about leaving before dawn on the fourth morning, because some old fear told him not to let himself be found, to trust something good before it could be taken away. He told her about Harold, the newspapers, the galas, 11 years of being a very good decision instead of a son. He told her about the funeral and the 400 people who called him a credit to the community, and the terrible clean silence of realizing he did not know a single person who loved him for nothing at all. And then he told her about walking into a diner on a cold night and being handed a bowl of soup by a woman who asked for nothing, and how it had felt for the first time in 15 years like being seen instead of assessed. "I never meant to test you," he said, his voice unsteady now, the careful composure of a boardroom entirely gone. "I know that's what it must look like, some rich man playing games to see if a poor woman would prove herself worthy. That was never it, Rosie. I wasn't testing you. I was drowning, and you were the first real thing I'd found to hold on to in longer than I can tell you, and I was so afraid that the moment you knew what I was worth, everything real about it would disappear, that you'd start treating me the way everyone else does. Careful, calculating, different." His voice broke fully now. "I was wrong to keep it from you. I know that. But I wasn't wrong about what I felt standing in your kitchen every night, and I need you to know the difference between those two things, even if you can't forgive the first one." The snow was falling harder now, catching in Rosie's hair, in the folds of Walt's canvas coat, in the silence that stretched long and unbroken across the porch. "The mortgage," Rosie said finally, very quietly. "That was you too." "Yes. You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Grady said. "More than I've wanted almost anything. Your father saved my life and never once let himself think about what it cost him to do it. I couldn't give him back 15 years, Rosie, but I could give him this." Rosie looked at him a long moment, something in her face still guarded, still raw, but no longer entirely closed. She glanced at her father, who stood watching them both with an old man's patient, aching hope, and then back at Grady, standing before her in the falling snow, with his ribs bound and his face bruised and every carefully built wall he'd spent 11 years constructing finally, entirely, down. "I need time," she said. "I believe you. I think I believe every word of that. But believing you and forgiving you aren't the same thing yet, and I'm not going to pretend they are just because you're standing here bleeding and sorry." Her voice wavered, and something under the hurt cracked open just slightly toward something gentler. "Go home, Grady, wherever that actually is. Heal. Let me think." He nodded, throat too tight for words, and turned to go, and stopped when Walt's hand closed once more around his arm. "You'll be back," Walt said. Not a question, the old certainty of a man who had once waited 15 years already, and had learned in that waiting exactly how patient love could afford to be. "This family isn't done with you yet, son. Whatever she needs to work through, you give her the room to work through it. But you come back." "Yes, sir," Grady said. "I will." He walked back down the porch steps into the thickening snow ribs, aching heart cracked wide open, in a way that felt strangely less like an ending than a beginning, and did not yet know that the truth he had just told, painful and incomplete, as it still felt, was only the first of two devastating revelations this family would have to survive together before the story could find its way toward healing. 10 days passed before Walt Hutchins collapsed in the north pasture. Rosie found him there near dusk, folded awkwardly against the fence line, one hand still gripping a length of wire he'd been stringing, when his chest had seized without warning, his breath coming in short, wet, frightening pulls that turned her blood to ice the moment she reached him. She got him into the truck the same way she'd gotten Grady in weeks before, some deep, terrified strength rising up from nowhere, and drove the same road to the same hospital, praying the same prayers, her hands shaking so hard on the wheel that she nearly missed the turn. Grady arrived at Billings Clinic, within the hour, having broken every speed limit between the ranch and town, the moment Rosie's call reached him, the first call she had made to him since the porch, since "I need time," and the fear in her voice had erased instantly and completely whatever careful and fortin distance either of them had been trying to maintain. He found her in the same corridor where she had learned his name 3 weeks earlier, sitting now in a plastic chair with her face in her hands, and did not hesitate before sitting beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. "They won't tell me anything yet," she said, not lifting her head. "Just that they're running tests. His heart, they think, or his lungs. They keep asking questions I don't have answers to. Has he had episodes like this before? Has he ever been treated for chronic lung damage? Was he ever hospitalized for hypothermia?" Her voice cracked. "I don't know, Grady. He's never once in my whole life told me he was sick. He just gets tired sometimes in winter, coughs worse than he used to, and I thought that was just getting older. I never thought—" She stopped, And Grady felt something cold move through his own chest, a dread assembling itself slowly and terribly, piece by piece, the way Walt's own understanding had assembled itself at the kitchen table weeks before. Dr. Alvarez came to find them an hour later, tablet in hand, expression careful in the particular way doctors' expressions go careful before delivering something difficult. "Mr. Hutchins is stable," she said first, and Rosie's shoulders dropped an inch with relief before the doctor continued. "But I want to be honest with you both about what we found. Your father has significant scarring in both lungs, consistent with a severe, poorly treated case of pneumonia at some point in his past, likely decades ago given the extent of it. That scarring, combined with some old cardiac stress markers we're seeing, tells me he's been living with a chronic condition for a very long time. Untreated or undertreated for years." "That's not possible," Rosie said. "He's never been sick like that. Not since I've been alive. It would have predated your memory of him most likely," Dr. Alvarez said gently. "This kind of damage typically traces back to a single severe episode, untreated hypothermia, complicated by pneumonia most commonly. The kind of thing a person might survive without ever seeking proper medical care, if they couldn't afford it or didn't think it was serious enough at the time. The body compensates for years, decades sometimes, until it can't anymore." Grady sat very still beside Rosie, feeling the blood leave his own face, doing arithmetic. He did not want to complete, and could not stop himself from finishing anyway. 15 years ago, a blizzard. A man who spent 3 days out in the cold searching a county road for a half-frozen 16-year-old, who never once in all the years since mentioned what that search might have cost his own body. "When can we see him?" Rosie asked. "Now, if you'd like. He's asking for both of you." They found Walt propped up in a hospital bed, an oxygen line looped beneath his nose, looking smaller and grayer than Grady had ever seen him. Smaller even than he had looked stooped over the old tractor engine that first morning, smaller than a man who had once carried a half-dead boy across a snow-packed field should ever look. "There he is," Walt said, voice thin but warm when Grady stepped through the door. "Come on in, son. Both of you. Quit standing in the doorway like you're afraid of me." Grady crossed the room and took the chair beside the bed, Rosie taking the other, and for a moment none of them spoke. The machines beside Walt's bed clicking and beeping, their steady, watchful rhythm. "The doctor tell you what she found?" Walt asked. "Some of it," Rosie said. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell us you'd been sick like that? Pneumonia bad enough to scar your lungs, that's not nothing. That's not something a person just forgets to mention." Walt was quiet, a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the gray winter light beyond it, and when he spoke again his voice had gone soft with a memory he had clearly carried alone for a very long time. "There was a winter," he said slowly, "a bad one, worse than most. I was out 3 straight days in it, looking for something I'd seen on the road, a shape moving out past the county line where I had no real business being in that kind of weather. Took me most of a day just to find him. Took another 2 to get him warm enough to travel, keep him fed, keep the fever off him while it tried to set in." His eyes found Grady's steady, unashamed, entirely without regret. "I got a fever of my own about a week after. Never told your mother how bad it got. Rosalind didn't want her worrying, and by the time it passed I figured whatever damage was done, and there wasn't much sense dwelling on it." He smiled faintly. "Didn't figure I'd need my lungs in perfect shape to string fence wire and love my daughter well. Turned out to be a fair trade, all things considered." The room went very still. "Walt," Grady said, his voice barely holding together, "you're saying that fever, that scarring, it happened because of me? Because you spent 3 days looking for me in a blizzard and never got properly treated afterward because you couldn't afford it or wouldn't spend the money on yourself?" "I'm saying," Walt cut in gently but firmly, "that I made a choice 15 years ago and I have never once regretted it, not for a single day since. And I am not about to let you sit there now and turn the proudest decision of my life into something you owe me for." His hand found Grady's, gripping it with more strength than his frail appearance suggested he still carried. "You hear me, son. I didn't go out into that storm because I calculated the cost and decided you were worth it. I went because there was a child freezing to death on a road near my land, and any decent person does the same thing. And if my lungs paid a little for that, then my lungs paid for something worth paying for." His eyes were wet now, though his voice stayed steady. "Don't you dare turn my choice into your guilt. That's not a gift I'm willing to let you twist into a burden." Grady felt something break open in his chest, wide and unbearable, 15 years of unspoken debt colliding all at once with the plain, stubborn refusal of the man who had incurred it. "I don't know how to just accept that," Grady said, voice raw. "I don't know how to hear that you've been quietly dying a little more every winter because of a choice you made to save my life, and just let that be okay. Then let me teach you. Walt said quieter now, the same way I've been trying to teach you all along without you fully realizing it. Some things aren't debts, Grady. Some things are just love given plain and free, and the only wrong response to it is trying to pay it back like it was a loan. He glanced toward Rosie, then back to Grady, something knowing and gentle in his tired face. Same as what she gave you that tin of savings. Same as what you gave us that mortgage. None of it was ever supposed to be settled up, son. It was just supposed to be received. Rosie sat with tears sliding silent down her face, her hand finding Grady's on the other side of the bed. The three of them linked now in a way that no longer had anything to do with secrets or debts or careful distances, only with the plain, unbearable, healing truth that some kinds of love arrive without any expectation of repayment at all, and the only thing left to do with them is to finally fully let them in. Walt was released from Billings Clinic 4 days later, breath still, a little shallow chest, still wrapped but stable, a course of proper treatment finally underway, for a condition that had gone unaddressed for 15 years, medication and oxygen therapy that Grady had arranged before the paperwork could even be raised as a question quietly settled the same way the mortgage had been settled, though this time there was no pretending about who had done it. Dutch Ryan arrived at the ranch the same afternoon. Walt came home, and he did not come with flowers or well wishes. He came with a folder thick and carefully organized, and an expression Grady had seen only a handful of times in 30 years of friendship. The particular grim satisfaction of a man who has found exactly what he went looking for. "We need to talk," Dutch said, setting the folder on the kitchen table where Rosie was pouring coffee. Walt settled in the armchair by the window with a blanket over his knees, watching the exchange with the alert curiosity of a man too, stubborn to let a little heart damage slow down his interest in his own family's business. About what, Rosie asked. About the truck that ran Grady off County Road 9. Dutch opened the folder, spreading photographs and printed documents across the table. "I've had somebody looking into it since the night it happened. Wasn't hard once we knew where to look. The truck belongs to a man named Ray Doss, does occasional work for Chip Preston's family. Ray's got a record. Assault, mostly a couple of intimidation charges that got quietly dropped over the years, the kind of thing that happens when the person paying your legal bills has enough money to make problems disappear." Rosie's hand went still on the coffee pot. "Chip did this. Chip ordered this," Dutch said. "We've got a call log. Ray's phone the night of the accident, 3 calls to a number registered to Chip Preston, the last one placed 40 minutes before Grady went into that ditch." He pulled another page free. "And that's not even the interesting part. There's more," Walt asked from his chair, voice still thin but sharp with attention. "There's considerably more." Dutch's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I got curious about the Preston family's oil holdings, the ones Deb's so fond of bringing up. Turns out there aren't any. Not real ones anyway. Chip's father took out 3 separate loans against land leases that expired 2 years ago and never renewed. The whole oil family story is built on paper that stopped being worth anything before Chip ever started courting Rosie. He's not offering security, Rosie. He's shopping for a bailout, and you were supposed to be the transaction that saved him." The kitchen went very quiet. Outside wind moved through the bare cottonwoods along the drive, the same wind that had once carried a half-frozen boy across this same land 15 years before. "I need to sit down," Rosie said, though she was already sitting, and lowered her face into her hands instead, a short, disbelieving laugh escaping her that had no humor in it at all. "My aunt was ready to marry me off to a con artist because she thought it was the responsible choice, the safe one." She looked up, eyes bright with something between anger and exhausted relief. "And the man she called a drifter off the street just quietly saved this entire family without asking for a single thing back." "I need you to look at one more thing," Dutch said more gently now, and slid a final photograph across the table, a grainy still pulled from a gas station security camera 2 counties over, time-stamped the night of the attack. It showed Ray Doss's truck at a pump, and in the passenger seat, half-turned toward the camera, unmistakable even in poor resolution, Chip Preston, himself present for at least part of the plan, not merely a man who had made a phone call and looked away. "That's enough for the sheriff," Dutch said quietly. "More than enough. I already made the call on the drive over. They should be arriving within the hour." They were. Deb Hutchins arrived not long after, summoned by a call from Walt that had been shorter and more serious than any conversation the two of them had shared in years, and she stood in the Hutchins kitchen with her coat still buttoned, disbelief warring openly across her face, as Dutch laid the evidence out for her the same way he had for the rest of the family. "There has to be some mistake," Deb said, though her voice had already begun to waver. "Chip's family has been in Billings for 2 generations running on leases that expired before Chip finished college. Dutch said, not unkindly but without softening the facts either. I'm sorry, Deb. I know you thought you were protecting her. Deb sank slowly into a kitchen chair, the fight going out of her all at once, replaced by something raw and mortified. I called that boy respectable, she said mostly to herself. I called him safe, Rosalind, over a man who quietly paid off your father's mortgage and never once asked for credit. She shook her head, tears rising fast and unguarded. I was so afraid of watching you struggle the way your mother struggled that I couldn't see what was standing right in front of me the whole time. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. Rosie crossed the kitchen and knelt beside her aunt's chair, taking her hands. You were scared for me. I understand that now more than I did a month ago. She glanced back at Grady, standing quiet near the doorway, ribs still faintly bruised beneath his shirt, watching the scene unfold, with an expression caught somewhere between vindication and grief for how much pain it had taken to arrive at this particular truth. Turns out being scared can make good people believe the wrong story for a while. I don't think that makes you a bad person, Aunt Deb. It just makes you human. The sheriff's cruiser turned up the gravel drive 20 minutes later, lights off, no siren. The deputy explaining quietly to Walt on the porch that they had enough. Now the call log, the security footage, a statement Ray Doss had already given in exchange for a reduced charge naming Chip Preston explicitly as the one who'd ordered the attack and paid for it to bring Chip in for questioning that same evening, with formal charges expected to follow within days. Grady watched the cruiser pull back down the drive sometime later, watched Deb's car follow it slowly out onto the county road, and felt something in his chest that was not quite triumph. There was no triumph in watching a young man's whole constructed life collapse, however much he'd earned the collapse, but something closer to a long overdue exhale. The particular relief of watching a threat finally named and removed from a family that had already survived more than its share of hardship without ever once asking for pity. You okay? Rosie asked, coming to stand beside him on the porch as the last of the daylight drained purple over the rim rocks. I keep thinking about how close it came, Grady admitted quietly. If Ray Doss had aimed the truck a little differently, if you hadn't happened down that road at exactly the right moment twice 15 years apart. He shook his head slowly. I've spent my whole life believing I had to earn every good thing that ever happened to me. I'm only now starting to understand how much of it was never earned at all, just given by people who happened to be paying attention when it mattered. Rosie was quiet a moment, watching the sky finish its slow fade toward dark. My dad has a saying, she said finally. Says the world isn't as short on good people as it sometimes looks. Just short on people willing to notice when somebody needs one. She glanced sideways at him, something softer than anger, finally settling into her face, the first real warmth he'd seen there since the hospital corridor. I think you've been noticing this whole time, Grady, even when you were scared to let anybody notice you back. He turned to look at her fully then, and for the first time since the truth had broken open between them, felt something like hope stir cautiously back to life in his chest. Not certainty, not yet, not forgiveness fully arrived at, but the beginning of a road back toward it, laid down one honest evening at a time. Spring came late that year, the way it always did in Montana winter, loosening its grip in fits, and starts through most of April before finally decisively giving way. The Hutchins pasture greened, slowly patch by patch snowmelt, running silver down toward the creek bed, and by the third week of May, Walt Hutchins was strong enough to stand on his own porch without the oxygen-line breath. Steady color returned fully to his face for the first time in months. It was on a Saturday in late May that trucks began arriving up the long gravel drive from noon onward. Not black SUVs, not caterers in white coats, but the ordinary trucks of an ordinary Montana community, regulars from the Home Plate Cafe, ranch hands from 3 counties over, the pharmacist who'd filled Walt's new prescriptions, the young deputy who'd made the arrest back in winter, the diner's cook carrying 2 enormous sheet cakes balanced against her hip like she'd done it 100 times before. Grady had insisted on this weeks earlier, sitting at the kitchen table while Dutch ran through logistics on a legal pad. No gala, Grady had said. No ballroom, no orchestra, none of it. If I'm doing this, I want it done here. In the yard. With the people who actually know this family. Dutch had looked at him a long moment, then nodded, understanding, arriving without needing to be spoken aloud. By late afternoon, folding tables lined the yard between the house and the barn, strung with simple lights. Dutch had spent the morning hanging from fence posts, and the community had gathered in a way the ranch hadn't seen in years since. Before Rosie's mother passed, Walt said quietly to anyone who asked, since the days when this place used to fill up with neighbors just because neighbors were what a place like this was for, Rosie moved through the crowd in a plain blue dress, hair loose for once, instead of nodded back for a shift, greeting people she'd known her whole life, and trying without much success to guess what exactly Grady had planned. He had told her only that he wanted to say something publicly in front of the people who mattered, that it was time the whole truth stopped living in careful private conversations and became something the community could witness together. At 6 o'clock, as the light began its long gold slide toward the rim rocks, Grady climbed onto the bed of an old flatbed truck parked at the center of the yard, and the crowd's noise settled by degrees into an attentive hush. "Most of you know me as Gray," he said, his voice carrying clear across the yard, unamplified plain. "Some of you have started calling me Grady these past few months, and I imagine a few of you are still working out which one's real." He paused, hands loose at his sides. None of the practiced polish of a boardroom in his posture now. Just a man standing in front of people he'd come to love, telling the truth the way it should have been told from the start. "The answer is both. Grady Holt is my name. I run Holt Cattle Co. I also spent 4 weeks this past winter sleeping in ditches and barnyards on the edge of this town, and I did it because I'd stopped believing anybody could love me without first calculating what I was worth." A murmur moved through the crowd, though most had already heard some version of the story by now. Small towns keep few secrets for long, and this one had been the subject of considerable conversation at the diner counter for months. "I was 11 years old when I watched my mother die, protecting me from a man who should have protected us both." Grady went on, and the yard went entirely still. "I spent the next 5 years being moved from one house to another until I finally ran in the middle of a January blizzard with nowhere to go and nothing to lose. I would have died on County Road 9 15 years ago if a man standing right there hadn't gone looking for me in a storm bad enough that most people wouldn't have gone looking for their own dog." He looked down at Walt, standing near the front of the crowd with one hand resting on Rosie's shoulder, and his voice cracked open, unguarded. "Walt Hutchins fed me, warmed me, and asked for nothing in return, and it cost him 15 years of his health that none of us knew about until this past winter, because he never once thought his own sacrifice was worth mentioning." Grady's jaw worked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "The man who adopted me afterward gave me every material thing a boy could want, and never once in 11 years made me feel like anything more than a very good decision he'd made for his own reputation. So by the time I came here this winter, I didn't know what real love looked like anymore. I'd forgotten it existed outside of a transaction." He turned then and found Rosie's eyes across the yard, and the crowd, sensing what was coming, seemed to lean forward as one. Rosalind Hutchins fed a stranger she thought had nothing, and gave him everything she'd saved in 4 years without once asking what she'd get back. Her father found me twice in one lifetime, once as a boy dying in the cold and once as a grown man who'd forgotten how to let himself be loved, and both times he simply opened his door. Grady's voice broke fully, now tears standing plain and unashamed on his face in front of the whole gathered community. "I came here a month ago looking for proof that unconditional love still existed in the world. I found more than proof. I found the two people who taught me for the first time in my life that I never had to earn it in the first place." He climbed down from the flatbed and crossed the yard to where Rosie stood, her own face wet now, and reached into his jacket pocket, not for a velvet box, but for the same battered cookie tin she had once pressed into his hands in the hayloft, its faded holly still catching the last of the evening light. "You gave me this once," he said, opening it to reveal a simple ring nestled where 4 years of savings had once been folded tight, "and I've never been given anything in my adult life that meant more. I'm not asking you to marry a billionaire, Rosie. I'm asking the woman who fed a hungry stranger without checking his bank account first to marry the man that stranger actually was underneath it all. The one who's still learning every single day that he doesn't have to prove anything to be loved. I'm asking you to keep teaching me that, for the rest of my life, if you'll let me." Rosie stood very still for a long moment, tears sliding freely, now the whole yard holding its breath around her, Deb near the front with both hands pressed to her mouth, Dutch standing just behind Grady with an expression caught somewhere between pride and unshed tears of his own. Walt watching his daughter with the steady, patient hope of a man who had waited 15 years to see exactly this. "Yes," Rosie said, voice breaking on the single word, and then louder, laughing through her tears, as the whole yard erupted into cheering. "Yes, Grady, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that shook and pulled her into an embrace that lifted her briefly off the ground despite his still healing ribs, the string lights swaying gently overhead, the last gold light of the Montana evening settling warm across a yard full of people who had, in their own small ways, all played some part in a story that had started with a bowl of soup and ended at last with a man finally believing he was worth loving, exactly as he was. Walt made his way slowly through the crowd afterward, and when he reached them, he did not say anything grand. He simply put one hand on Grady's shoulder and the other on his daughter's and held them both there a moment. The three of them standing together in the fading light. 15 years of waiting finally quietly come home. The wedding took place at the Hutchins Ranch in early autumn when the cottonwoods along the creek had turned gold, and the Montana sky carried that particular high, clear blue that only seems to arrive once the summer heat has finally broken. There was no ballroom, no orchestra, no guest list curated by a publicist. Folding chairs lined the same yard where Grady had proposed months before, and Walt Hutchins, steady now, breathing easy, 3 seasons into proper treatment, walked his daughter across the grass himself, refusing, despite Rosie's gentle protests, any offer of a cane to lean on. Dutch Ryan stood beside Grady as best man, and when it came time for his toast, he raised his glass with a voice thick enough that everyone in the yard understood exactly how much the moment cost him to get through without breaking down. Entirely. "I've known this man since we were 9 years old, stealing peaches off a fence that wasn't ours," Dutch said, looking at Grady. "I watched him build an empire out of nothing but stubbornness and early mornings, and I always thought that was the most impressive thing he'd ever do. I was wrong. The most impressive thing he ever did was let himself be loved without needing to earn it first." He turned to Rosie. "Thank you for teaching my oldest friend something I never could." Deb Hutchins cried through the whole ceremony, seated in the front row beside a chair that would remain for the rest of her life, a quiet reminder of how close fear had come to costing her niece everything real. She had spent the months since Chip Preston's arrest working hard to rebuild the trust she'd nearly spent recklessly, and Rosie, in the particular grace of someone who understood that fear and love often wear the same face, had let her back in fully without keeping score. By the following spring, Holt Cattle Co. had quietly launched something new, a foundation, unnamed after Grady himself, that existed for one purpose: only helping small ranching families like the Hutchinses stay on their land through hard winters, medical emergencies, and the kind of debt that piles up silently until it becomes a crisis. Grady insisted the foundation's work be done without press releases, without his name attached to any single act of help. He had learned, in the months since the blizzard 15 years behind him finally circled back to meet the present, that the best kindness rarely announces itself, and the deepest love almost never keeps a ledger. Walt lived many more good years after that October wedding, long enough to teach his first grandchild how to fork hay into a feeder trough the same patient way he'd once taught a half-frozen 16-year-old how to be warm again. And Grady, a man who had once believed in the marrow of his bones that love only came to people who had proven themselves worth it, spent the rest of his life learning the opposite lesson, one ordinary Montana morning at a time, that the people who loved him best had never once been keeping score. If you followed this story all the way to the end, you already know it was never really about wealth or disguise or a blizzard on a lonely county road. It was about something much simpler and much harder to hold on to in a world that often teaches us the opposite. The idea that real love asks for nothing in return, that kindness given freely is never wasted, and that the people who show up for us when we have nothing to offer them are the ones worth holding on to for the rest of our lives. Grady Holt had every material thing a person could want, and still spent years starving for something no amount of money could buy: the simple, unguarded feeling of being cared for without having to prove he deserved it. It took a bowl of soup from a stranger, a father's decades-old sacrifice he never once mentioned, and a young woman brave enough to give away 4 years of savings to a man she thought had nothing. It took all of that for him to finally understand a lesson so many of us forget in the noise of everyday life: that we do not have to be useful or impressive or successful to be worthy of love. We only have to be honest and willing to receive it when it's offered. There's a lesson here, too, in what Walt Hutchins gave without ever expecting anything back: the reminder that the smallest acts of decency offered without calculation can ripple outward for 15 years and quietly shape the entire course of another person's life. We rarely know in the moment we choose to help a stranger how far that kindness will eventually travel, or whose life it might one day save in return. Walt never went looking for gratitude. He simply could not walk past a child freezing in the cold. And in the end, that single, unremarkable decision became the foundation of everything good that followed. And there's a lesson finally in what it cost Grady to finally speak the truth out loud. The reminder that love without honesty is only a beautiful lie waiting to break, and that real intimacy requires the courage to be fully seen, mistakes and wounds and all, rather than carefully curated and hidden behind whatever mask feels safest to wear. So here's the question I want to leave you with tonight. The same question this whole story has been quietly asking from the very first scene of a man kneeling cold and humiliated against a brick wall in downtown Billings. What lesson did you take from this story? Was it Walt's lesson that kindness given without expectation always finds its way back around sometimes, in ways we could never have predicted? Was it Rosie's lesson that real love sees a person clearly long before it ever learns what they're worth? Or was it Grady's lesson, the hardest one perhaps, that healing begins the moment we finally let ourselves be loved without needing to earn it first? I'd love to know. Scroll down and leave a comment right below this video, and tell me which part of this story moved you the most, and what lesson are you carrying with you tonight? I read every single comment, and I promise you some of the most beautiful reflections on this channel have come from you, the audience, sharing your own stories of kindness given and kindness received. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video. It genuinely helps more people discover these stories. Share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder tonight that love doesn't have to be earned to be real. Leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so you never miss the next story. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending this time with Grady, Rosie, and the Hutchins family tonight. Take care of yourselves, be gentle with the people around you, and remember you never know whose whole life might change, because you chose on one ordinary cold night to offer a stranger a bowl of soup. See you in the next video.